So, the Z-depth channel is one we can use for many purposes. It can be used to help mask an area, to introduce some atmos, to generate things like depth of field, just to name a few. Now, we don't need depth of field for this shot, but we can take a look at this later. So, let's create some Z-depth fog or some Z-depth atmos in this render. So first thing I need to do is drop down a bitmap node and plug this in. Now the bitmap is set to alpha, so let's set this to blue. And that's to reflect the Z essentially in 3D space. So if I drag this in, at the moment it's all white, but if I change the high value to something like 5000, then we start to see the distance within the scene, and that's because this is based on the scene rather than just a generic value. So this does a pretty good job as is. You can see how this could be easily used for fog. If we wanted to, make it more intense, we can play with these values to push it backwards a bit more or bring it forwards a little more, depending on what you need. We also have the option to reduce its overall intensity here. We could also do that after we merge it on top. We can add some blur if we want to, or we can invert it. It's also good practice to leave the clip white and the clip black on, as these values can become very high and cause some issues later. There are of course some cases where you do want to remove this. So at the moment it's white, but ideally we want this to be a blue, similar to our atmos here. So let me just drop down a background node to do this, and this is just a solid color. So let me drop this down. On the node itself, we can choose the color here. If I press this little arrow, it opens up a color wheel, and we can just choose a blue. Something like this maybe. Bearing in mind, we have it before the LUT, so we'll change it after we apply this. And I also want to set the height here to 803 to match the render. And make sure that it's 32-bit. Now it should inherit it from the Z-depth, but just to make sure, let me just switch that over. We also have the option of a gradient here. A 4 color, which allows you to change it per point at the edges of the frame here, and finally just a custom gradient where we can move this around. But for this, I'm okay with just the solid color, and I'll plug this in. Cool. So this gives us, if I disable the checker here, just press this one, a colored atmosphere essentially. Nice. So here you can see it's also affecting the sky, and I don't quite want this to happen. So let me just change this and use the Z depth to create a mask here just by clamping this. There we go. And I will invert it. And now what we can do is multiply this on top. So let me just drag this in. And on this bitmap, a new paint mode parameter has opened up. You can see that coming in. And this allows us to blend between a couple of these bitmaps. So for instance, I could switch this to maximum or minimum, which acts kind of like a multiply here. There we go. So now we have the sky removed here. One thing we do get is this fringing. And since it's quite a clean edge, I can get away with an erode dilate just to clean this up. And an erode dilate sharpens up or opens up any incoming image. So let me just show you this. If I drag this up, you can see it begins to eat in or open up the mask itself. So let me just eat it in a little bit. As little as possible just to remove that white line. Awesome. Cool. So now we have some sort of Z-depth Atmos pass that we can add in. So let's see what it looks like compared to this guy here. If I just replace this. It's pretty similar. It's getting a little bit tight here on the road dilate. Nice. So we could get this to look almost exactly the same as this guy here just by tweaking some of these values to change the depth itself and also the color. Let's make it a little bit more teal. Probably do something like this. And now I could go ahead and compare the two and match it, but I don't need to go that far. I'm sure you get the idea. Nice, so that's how we would use this to set up a basic Z-depth pass. We could quickly add some extra volumes using the fast noise node. So let me drop this down as a fast noise here. And this node allows you to create some fast noise, some smoke-like textures that you can apply on top of your image. So let me just up the detail here and up the scale. And this is fine for me. We could also, if you like, change the seed rate, or we could even animate this if we wanted to, and change the brightness and the contrast. One thing I want to change is the color. So let's say we wanted a little bit of blue haze similar to what we had before. Something like this. And we could plug this in here. Not quite what we want, but what we can do is mask this by maybe some Z-depth noise. So let me just use this Z-depth that we have and invert it. And bring it to just the foreground. We can use negative values if we want it to start behind the camera. This is fine. And on the fast noise, I also want to change this to match the resolution and be 32-bit. Okay, so if I use that as a mask, you can see we begin to only get it here. If I add it on top, it comes in the foreground. Let me just clamp this a little more. And maybe up the contrast. So what we are getting here is just a little bit of atmospheric noise just in the foreground here. Now this of course works for the 2D image. If we wanted to add this to the 3D, for instance the moving camera, we'd need to approach it a little bit differently, but we can cover that a bit later. Okay, so the last node that I want to demonstrate is the rays node, which lets you generate God rays if you didn't already set them up. Now this of course again is a 2D node, so you won't get the same accuracy or quality as setting it up in R node. So if I drop down the rays node, okay, and all we need into this is an aperture or a mask essentially to act as a window for the rays to come through. So if we take, say this guy here, and I invert this, disable the inversion and plug this in. And move this little manipulator here, you can see we begin to get something akin to light shining through from behind. On the parameters here, we can change the decay, which just increases or decreases the length. We have the weight, which is essentially the density, the blend, which blends it on and off, and the exposure, which changes the intensity. So we also have the threshold, which would work based on the values of the incoming mask. So let me just drop this on top. Now, it of course doesn't make sense because the God rays here are brighter than the sky itself. Let me just use a background instead. Okay, and this would simulate just some light coming through from behind. Cool, so that's quite interesting. So this would obviously only be if you didn't set them up in 3D, as the 3D would be more accurate. Cool. So let's move on to looking at some masks, including some volume masks.